Our next guest is Dr. Einat Wilf, and Einat is a phenomenal thinker, a real leader on all things Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, education, and feminism. And she was a member of parliament with the Labour Party from 2010 to 2013. She served as a chair of the Education Committee, a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee. Einat was also an intelligence officer in the IDF. She was policy advisor to Shimon Peres when he was prime minister. She was also a consultant with McKinsey and has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD, and a political science PhD from Cambridge. So it's pretty rare to hear someone who's covered Harvard, INSEAD, and Cambridge, but as well as now being a lecturer at the Reichman University in Israel. Einat is also an author of 7 books, including We Should All Be Zionists, which is a title that obviously we are collectively in great agreement with, and is an expert on all things UNRWA as well, and the law of return and the Middle Eastern conflict. So we've asked Einat to give us a bit of an update on everything that's happening, with UNRWA being so topical and in the news, and with all of us being Australian taxpayers who in part fund UNRWA. It's important for us to understand UNRWA in depth, and also importantly, what does this mean for the future of Gaza? So Einat, it's such an honor and a pleasure for us to have you with us. And so I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be with you. And I might even be physically coming to Australia in mid-March. So 3 weeks from now. So I'll definitely keep you posted. So UNRWA, I've spent by now a good 15 years writing about it, talking about it, researching it. And I can assure you quite a few people raised eyebrows on why I was devoting myself to something that is supposedly so minor and marginal, and, you know, put so many of my capabilities to this issue. Why? And I want to make the case that it's actually the issue, and that within the story of UNRWA, you have encapsulated the essence of the conflict and also what needs to be done to finally end it. So in order to understand UNRWA a bit, I sometimes think that it's good to think of an airplane. An airplane is a lovely machine until it gets hijacked and flown into a building. In the same way, UNRWA begins with all the best of intentions and then gets hijacked into one of the most devastating war machines. What does it mean that it starts with the best of intentions? As a result of the absolutely and completely unnecessary war that the Arabs wage between November 1947 until mid-1949, a war which, again, was entirely unnecessary. They could have said yes to partition. That somehow never crosses anyone's mind. And we would have had 75 years of a prosperous Arab state living side by side with a Jewish state. But they were so devoted, and they made it clear that as far as they're concerned, partition is not a legitimate idea. A Jewish state is not a legitimate idea in any size. They said it, not even the size of a postal stamp. And they wage war, initially the Arabs of the land, now known as Palestinians, in parentheses, another hijacked term, and beginning in May 1948 with several Arab countries and Arab forces. As a result of this war, refugees are created. There is nothing unique in that. This is the 20th century. Empires collapse, new states emerge, new borders are delineated. Tens of millions of people become refugees in the process as they flee across newly delineated borders, typically to the side that is more ethnically similar to them. And the message to all these refugees is that this is tough, It's tragic, but you move on. And it was understood that settling refugees in third places, is how you end wars. But the Arab refugees did not want to end the war. So a temporary agency was established, initially intended to be called REWA or UNRWA, in order to settle the Arab refugees from the war. But the Arab refugees refused settlement because they understood that if they are settled in place in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Jordan, in Syria, and Lebanon, the places to which they fled, this would be the end of the war. And the one thing that they were not willing to accept, that the war ended. And this is, again, to our present moment, as I'm sure you know, the Arab countries were only willing to sign ceasefire, armistice agreements with Israel rather than peace, because, again, from their perspective, the war has not ended. This is to all the people who call for a ceasefire now. It's an old way in the Arab pattern to just go for ceasefires because as far as they're concerned, the war continues. So the Arab refugees refused settlement because they wanted the war to continue. And the mechanism that was supposed to settle them, that agency, they basically operated against it. They attacked its employees. They attacked its installations. They refused to be settled. And it's not, we sometimes tell the story that the Arab refugees were pawns of the Arab countries. It's actually, it works together. And if anything, it's the opposite. A Palestinian extremist murdered, assassinated King Abdullah of Jordan because King Abdullah was actually willing to settle the refugees and naturalize them and wanted to make peace with Israel. And again, that was unacceptable. So this agency essentially gets hijacked by the Arab refugees in order not to settle them, but to keep them perpetually as refugees and thereby send the message that the war of 1948 is not over. In the process of hijacking the agency, the Arabs did three things. First, they made sure that it was called UNRWA. So it had the letters UN. UNRWA is a temporary mechanism established by the General Assembly. It's not really a UN organ, but the Arab countries wanted to make sure that the UN letters are there because that's an old view of theirs. They never, ever assume responsibility for anything. They never say, oh, we waged an unnecessary war. It was a stupid idea. Refugees were created in that war. It's on us. To them, there's only one story. The Jews did not create the state. The Jews are the tools of some kind of imperial control. The United Nations created Israel. They will never agree to assign agency to the Jews that they have really created their state. So as far as they're concerned, the war, the Arab refugees, everything, that's on the world, that's on the UN. They bear zero responsibility for the fact that there are Arab refugees. So first, they made sure that the agency was called UNRWA rather than REWA or UNRWA, so that it'd be clear that the Arab refugees are the responsibility of the world, of the UN. Then they made sure that it secured a legal loophole compared to all the other Arab refugees. In tandem and parallel to UNRWA being a temporary mechanism, the United Nations establishes a permanent refugee agency called the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which is intended to settle refugees and to implement the Refugee Convention. That's the refugee agency of the United Nations. Now, what the Arabs understood very well is that if the Arab refugees will be treated according to the Refugee Convention, according to all other refugees in the world, there would be no refugees within a few short years, because the Refugee Convention is not interested in who started a war, who's responsible, and what's just. It just tries to make sure that refugees personally are no longer refugees, and thereby all manner of ending the refugee status, settlement in place, settlement in a third country, going home if that's possible. All three ways of ending a person's refugee status are equally, and that's important, equally legitimate. The Arabs understood that if the settlement of Arab refugees in Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon would be considered a legitimate way of ending the Arab refugee status, within a few short years, there will be no Arab refugees. And they didn't want that. So they created a legal loophole. And basically, it says that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees deals with all the refugees in the world, except the ones that have an agency. And then the third thing that the Arabs did is ensure that UNRWA never closes, because the continued existence of UNRWA is what secures this legal loophole where UNRWA can do whatever it wants without any concern for any international standards. And this is how UNRWA inflates the number of refugees. We start with a few 100,000 in the wake of the war, and today they count 5.9 million because they refuse to settle anyone. They refuse to consider any political solution except the destruction of the state of Israel and so-called return. And they inflate the numbers by continuously, generation after generation, calling people who are not refugees by any international standard as refugees from Palestine. And at this point, when UNRWA is clearly never going to close, but also never going to settle any Arab refugee until there is no state of Israel, the Arab refugees begin to take over UNRWA and make it their own. It begins to be the education system, the healthcare system of an emerging Palestinian nationalism, which in itself is okay. There's nothing wrong with a new nationalism, except that the Palestinian nationalism that is forged in the UNRWA schools, in the compounds that are mistakenly called refugee camps, is a negative, destructive nationalism that is forged around the idea of the destruction of the Jewish state and the ideas of return, of perpetual refugeehood, that are all means for the destruction of the Jewish state. So UNRWA becomes essentially the womb in which this destructive Palestinian nationalism is born, sustained, fed, and grows. And as a result, it's no coincidence that generation after generation, UNRWA breeds trained murderers who all want to destroy the Jewish state. The Palestinian murderers, the perpetrators of the massacre of the Israeli athletes in the 1972 Munich Olympics, they are graduates of UNRWA schools. And if you read their texts, they were immensely proud that they are given the opportunity in their mind to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. And this is what UNRWA is. And this is why it matters for October 7th. It's not an aid agency. For the book, The War of Return, I invented a word called West-plaining, when Western diplomats and journalists explain away what Palestinians have just said. So, for example, Westerners believe that UNRWA is an aid agency, which it's not. But when you hear Palestinians, listen to what they're saying in the last few weeks when UNRWA is in the news. They're saying UNRWA is the guarantor of our right of return and our status as refugees. So the Palestinians say clearly, UNRWA is an agency that guarantees return. And just in case anyone thinks that return is some innocent idea, oh, they really missed the great-grandparents' home or something, read the texts. Return was what October 7th was. October 7th is the vision of Palestinian return. Return was never an innocent idea. It was always a triumphalist, violent butchery of the Jewish state, of sovereign Jews. That's what return was always in the Palestinian imagination, which is why you see such exhilaration on October 7th. And just so you know, one of the reasons that Gaza is one of the worst places is that 3/4 of Gaza's residents are registered by UNRWA as refugees. This means that by now we have a 5th generation of people living in Gaza. And whatever your political views are, we can agree that Gaza is Palestine. It's between the river and the sea. It means that by now we have a 5th generation of people who were born in Palestine, lived there their entire lives, and are somehow registered by an agency that people think is UN as refugees from Palestine. This means that generation after generation is raised in Gaza with the clear understanding that Gaza is not their home and that they should not be making Gaza their home, because their real home, supposedly, is from the river to the sea, is the day when they will violently get rid of the Jewish state. And I, by now, have on the record books, essays, lectures, talks, interviews, all saying the same things for years. Do not give a single dollar. Do not give a bag of cement into Gaza, and I would say for that matter, West Bank and everywhere, as long as the dominant ideology of the people of Gaza is the UNRWA ideology of return. Because given that this is their ideology, you are guaranteed, Australia donor, that your money, that your legitimacy, that your political support, which you think is going to the poor Palestinians, is actually going to be used and abused in order to, from their perspective, liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. I have it on record on saying, you're going to give Palestinians a bag of cement with the ideology of from the river to the sea. You are guaranteed that that bag of cement will go underground to build tunnels that are going to be used to take back Palestine by violence, if necessary. So this is the entire conflict in a nutshell. You know, we celebrate Israeli independence. The Jews tell a story that on May 14th, 15th, Israel declared independence and we became a state, and that's it. Then we begin our story. We became a state. From the Arab-Palestinian perspective, they're like, you Jews can declare whatever you want, but it's not a done deal. So we think of it as something that creates a new timeline, but they still live in the same timeline, which is no Jewish state. And the fact that you Jews declared independence is really none of our business, because we're going to keep making sure that we work towards your non-existence. And that means that we will never settle. We will continue to educate generation after generation on the idea of perpetual refugeehood and return. And that's Gaza, and that's October 7th, and that's actually the entire Palestinian people. And this is also why Hamas represents the Palestinian people. October 7th was planned and executed on behalf of the Palestinian vision of return and no Jewish state. It was not some kind of pet project of Hamas that was done in contradiction to Palestinian values and vision and ethos, which means that the only way that we reverse it, the only way that we get out of it, is by reversing the equation. Money and legitimacy and political support were given for 75 years to Palestinians who perpetuated the idea that Israel is a temporary aberration. We need to reverse that and basically not just defund UNRWA and close it and dismantle the whole refugee and right of return fiction. Countries that currently fund UNRWA need to exactly reverse the equation and say, we will only fund, we will only support Palestinians who have rejected this ideology of return and perpetual refugeehood. We will give money only to Palestinians who have been removed and erased from the register of UNRWA as refugees. We will only support Palestinians who, in their own voice and publicly declare that they understand that they are not refugees and that they possess no right of return. The equation must be completely reversed if we are to chart any different path that does not look like multiple October 7th and the destruction that came after. So this is hopefully my effort to convince you that UNRWA encapsulates the entire conflict, the entire problematics of it, and also therefore shows how we can begin to reverse it. Thank you.
Thanks, Einat. I think you have an audience here that understands the inherent sort of deficiencies and corruption at UNRWA, and I hope you are able to make it to Australia in March so that you can speak to not just the government, who at least has paused its funding, but I think in particular to the officials within DFAT, that for those that have watched carefully recently have made some pretty outrageous comments during Senate estimates. We're going to open up some questions. I just want to start with one question. I mean, one of the big lessons sort of for me, I guess, since the 7th of October, not just in relation to UNRWA, but generally is, you know, everything in life is getting the balance between principle and pragmatism. And I think for me, one of the lessons from the 7th of October is I think we got that balance wrong on a whole heap of issues. Now, one is clearly UNRWA, you know, that people looked past the hate that was being taught within UNRWA schools. They looked past the systemic corruption, looked past the various links to Hamas and other terrorist groups. Because at the end of the day, and by the way, this is not just the world, right? These are Israeli officials. And, you know, I've been in Israel over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, and from many senior Israeli security officials saying, and from the IDF in particular, we don't really want UNRWA to be disbanded, because who's going to fill its place? How do we get this food in? You know, more poverty, lack of schooling is going to fuel extremism. And so it was actually always, I think, very complex for us in the diaspora when we would be calling on UNRWA to, on the government to at least apply better checks and balances or pause its funding. So I guess my question to you is now, in the midst of this war today, right now, where there is a very significant humanitarian disaster happening in Gaza, albeit all at Hamas's hands, what's the message that you think that should be conveyed to foreign governments like Australia that have paused their funding and are under enormous pressure locally, politically, from Muslim and Palestinian elements here in Australia to recommence it? And how do you think we as the Jewish community, but just generally, and also as Israel, to advocate in a way that doesn't come across as, frankly, heartless in terms of the suffering of Palestinian civilians?
So a word on being heartless before I turn to the exact messaging and practice. One of the things that I discovered over the years, I created this separation between feeling good and doing good, which is good for a lot of things in life: parenting, governance, and foreign policy. What does it mean to feel good? To feel good is to say, poor Palestinians, I don't want to be heartless, give money, and it does no good. It actually funds the conflict. And you talked about Israel. My first beef is with our own government. The book came out in Hebrew. I always said that I can tear down any UNRWA argument except one. When people tell me, what do you want from us? Your government has been asking for it. That's the one argument that I have very difficult matching. In parentheses, I sometimes respond to it by saying, do you do everything the Israeli government asks of you? But fine. But it's true. The problem begins home. I sincerely hope that, and you know, that's still a debate, that Israel will also snap out of this notion that you can purchase quiet, right? That and Adi and I, my co-writer, and I would have many meetings in the Israeli Defense Ministry, and we would tell them, like, this is not a steady state situation. all the money, all the political legitimacy that is being pumped into UNRWA and Gaza is not a steady state situation. It does not buy you stability. You're pumping air into a balloon that will explode, because it's not a steady state. It's something that increases and increases and increases. So I hope October 7th should launch people and dislodge people to understand that we actually need to reverse all these things. And it actually matters what people believe, what their ideology is. So that's kind of on the general understanding. And that also goes to the question of what's happening right now. Why are we where we are right now? We are where we are right now precisely because Western governments, and again, Israel too, closed their eyes to the ideology that was the governing ideology of the people of Gaza and the Palestinians at large. And we somehow thought that you could bribe people away from their ideology. That's why I kept on telling them, you cannot. You're going to give them a bag of cement, and that will not bribe them. That will be used by them to continue to wage the war that they have been committed to for over a century. Now, so I actually am very much of the view that goes back to the Jewish sages, that if you're going to be kind to the cruel, you're going to end up being cruel to the kind. And this is literally October 7th. This is intense brutality to the kindest, nicest, most peace-seeking people, precisely because we were kind to the cruel. And we kept on turning our gaze away from the ideology, from the vision, from what they wanted to achieve. But by all means, you want a message that talks about helping the Palestinians? My message is this: give them all the money in the world, but after you reverse the equation, only to those who have been erased from the rosters of UNRWA. They are not refugees from Palestine. Only to those who agree to, in return to everything they get, to announce that they are not refugees and that they do not possess a right of return. Begin to reverse the equation. Now, let us remember, Hamas has massive economic and financial assets that they have shielded from sanctions. One of the things that became even clearer to me after October 7th, I always spoke about how UNRWA, and it's important for me to mention, the problem with UNRWA is not a few people who worked at Hamas or who participated in October 7th. And it's not even corruption. I wish they had corruption. Maybe at least some of that money would have ended up in Swiss bank accounts rather than in tunnels. But the problem with UNRWA is the entire structure, the entire organization. There is not one good thing that the organization does. Its entire existence is intended for the purpose of perpetuating the war. So it's important to not allow anyone to deflect, to say, oh, we fired the people who participated on October 7th. That's not the issue. The issue is the entire organization that breeds generation after generation of murderers, precisely because it refuses to allow the war of 1948 and the existence of a Jewish state to be accepted as a done deal by the Palestinians. So the key right now has to be absolutely reverse the equation. You want to give money. Oh, I was saying what Hamas said. One thing that became clear after October 7th. A few weeks after October 7th, Abu Marzouk, one of the chief people of Hamas, goes on television and he's asked, why don't you let the people of Gaza use the tunnels for their protection? And he says, that's for us. They're the responsibility of the UN, essentially of UNRWA. And that really made it even clearer to me, that notion that the money that flows into UNRWA basically releases Hamas from any responsibility and essentially releases them to the job of butchering Jews. So you asked what will replace UNRWA. And I'll tell you, over the years, I would meet with people like DFAT and all that, and they'll be like, what will replace UNRWA? They always thought that this was like the killer argument, right? What will replace it? Again, once you understand that the entire purpose of UNRWA is to perpetuate the the war. And also when you understand that it's a Palestinian organization. You know, people think that if UNRWA closes down, some lovely Norwegians and Swedes that are currently in Gaza will go home. No, these are Gazans. They were born in Gaza. They are the teachers. They are the administrators. They are UNRWA. UNRWA is a Palestinian organization hijacked to become entirely Palestinian with a thin facade of Italians and Swiss in carefully tailored suits who will ask for money. It's easier to give money to someone like Lazzarini than to give money to a Palestinian who says from the river to the sea. But that's what the organization is. So all the money that has flown into UNRWA has essentially released Hamas from any responsibility. So over the years, when like a DFAC would say, what would replace UNRWA? What, do you want Hamas to do it? And I would say, yes. And they looked at me like a crazy person. And I said, look, because these are Palestinians, these are still, again, it's not foreign workers. These are Palestinians. Then closing down UNRWA removes the legitimacy, removes the perpetual refugeehood, but someone has to pay their salaries. Imagine that Hamas had to pay teachers' salaries rather than build 200 kilometers more tunnels. Maybe if Hamas had to pay teachers' salaries, we would have been in a different place today. Maybe if they had not been relieved of their responsibility for their people and relieved to focus on planning October 7th, we would be in a different place today. So I want to introduce the radical and innovative idea that the Palestinians are not a charity basket case, and therefore one does not need to be heartless. The Palestinians are an incredibly capable people. It's worth noting that on the eve of October 7th, the Human Development Index of Gaza, not the West Bank, of Gaza, was better than 90 countries in the world. So we need to stop telling the story that they murdered and butchered Jews because they were economically miserable. It's not the case. They had massive resources. October 7th required massive investment in infrastructure, financial and economic planning, discipline, strategy, vision, a perverse vision, but vision. These are not an incapable people. The Palestinians have never been an incapable people. They are a fully capable people with screwed up priorities that have decided to devote all their capabilities, all their abilities, all the resources that flow to them en masse, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times per capita, the Marshall Plan. They have devoted all that into destroying the Jewish state. So the problem is not their capabilities, it's their priorities. So Australia wants to give them money? Sure. Just make sure that they have different priorities so that the money actually goes to building something rather than destroying what we've built.
Thanks, Einat. I'm conscious we've got a few questions, but we are actually running out of time. What I might do is maybe just Josh, Ziggy, and Adele, if you just want to each one after the other very quickly ask a tight question, and I'll just give Einat one opportunity to give a very short answer to sort of address whatever key issues she can within a few minutes. Josh, do you want to go first, and we'll go Ziggy and then Adele. There might be double up.
And thanks for chatting to us. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on education, because you can disband UNRWA, you can, disband Hamas, but at the end of the day, if Palestinians are still being taught the same things about Israel and about Jews, there's no hope for the future. Do you have any thoughts on that and what can be done about that going forward?
Certainly. I think that definitely in Gaza, but broadly, it has to be made clear that no one outside, no Western country, no one will support any education that does not teach that the Jewish state is a legitimate historical presence that represents the historical connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. Especially in Gaza, I think this has to follow the model of the Americans in Japan, where essentially, I've been reading this great book called Embracing Defeat. Obviously, for the last few months, I've been very interested in what the Americans did in Japan, because once you understand that the challenge ahead of us is not killing 30,000 Hamas-trained murderers, we need to eradicate the entire destructive ideology of no Jewish state. We need to transform the Palestinian people away from a nationalism of destruction towards a nationalism of construction, then I think that it needs to be very clear within the Gaza Strip that no aid, nothing flows in to anyone who still holds that ideology. So, for example, if I were in charge, I would separate Gaza to the south and the north. The south can remain a war zone, but nothing should go in there. They'll be bordering with Egypt. They should manage on their own. The IDF should continue to raid and make sure that it's not a threat to Israel. And northern Gaza should be a place of reconstruction and peace, but only people who have been erased from UNRWA's rosters as refugees, have declared that they have no interest in liberating Palestine from the river to the sea, have no right of return, they're not refugees. Only then they can go north. They can have a school open for them. There are not going to be a lot of people to begin with. In that school, the curriculum will be clearly one that is about living next to the Jewish state. I call it an Abrahamic curriculum, one that looks at the Jewish people as kin, as a legitimate historical presence rather than a foreign implant. And that is the only kind of schools that will be allowed to operate. And contrary to the IDF's very, very mistaken view that people out of school are less radical than people in school, then, you know, we only need to look at Harvard to see that it's different. The notion that education necessarily de-radicalizes by itself is one that we should put to bed. It actually matters what is the content of that education, and we need to be as forceful as the Americans were in Japan on the content of that education. If there's time later, I'll tell the story of exactly what the Americans did in Japan. It's pretty crazy.
Thanks, Einat. I think, unfortunately, we have to move on, but I think if you do make it to Australia, you'll have some packed out crowds to hear in far more depth all of the important work you're doing. And thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in person either here or in Israel. You're welcome to stay, but understand you might have other things to do as well. So